Helps if I have my microphone on, and we'll start this all over again. Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. I apologize for being a few minutes late. Today, the subcommittee is holding the third hearing in its series on the impacts of oil and gas development, with this morning being dedicated to hearing testimony on Congressman Levin's H.R. 3225, the Restoring Community Input and Public Protections in Oil and Gas Leasing Act. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements are limited to the chair and to the ranking minority member or their designee. First, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements may be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objections, that is so ordered. First, I'd like to welcome our witnesses and particularly thank those of you who have traveled great distances. Since the passage of the National Environmental Policy Act almost 50 years ago, this country has been committed to the idea that people should have a say in governmental decisions that impact their lives. This idea is particularly important when it comes to our public lands, which literally belong to all Americans. The Department of Interior manages America's vast public lands to ensure that these resources are both accessible to people today and are protected for future generations. To carry out this mission, the Interior Department carefully balances its stewardship responsibilities with its other duties, like supporting oil and gas development in the right place at the right time. But finding that balance cannot be achieved without listening to the voices of the public. The more the public is involved, and the more likely that land management decisions will be long-lasting, scientifically sound, and have grassroots support. That's because local leaders know best what direction the community and the regional economy are headed, and the regional economies are headed. Tribal members know best how to identify and to protect sacred sites and cultural artifacts. And business owners know best how decisions may attract or discourage future investments. Energy development decisions are some of the most important that any community will face. We've heard in previous testimonies about how oil and gas development impact public health, cultural resources, drinking water, and farmland. By listening to those who would be the most affected, the Bureau of Land Management can work to minimize these potentially irreversible impacts and avoid conflict. But unfortunately, over the past 2.5 years, BLM has done the opposite and has prioritized the size and frequency of lease sales over the views of community members and the well-being of taxpayers. In January of 2008, BLM rolled back important oil and gas leasing reforms that had ensured that the public had a meaningful say in decisions about energy development on public lands. BLM shortened the protest period for lease sales from 30 days to 10 days, removed the requirement that the public be involved during the lease nominations, and removed a 30-day public review and comment period for environmental reviews. On top of these changes, BLM has offered, and I'm literally millions of acres of land for lease over the last few years with the clear goal of giving the fossil fuel industry as much access as possible. So what do you get when BLM steamrolls public engagement while holding bigger and more frequent lease sales across the country? You get harmful decisions that are opposed by local communities and challenged in the courts. Take, for example, proposed lease sales in the foothills of Nevada's Ruby Mountain, leasing near Chaco Canyon, and leasing near Bears Ears, or efforts to hold a lease sale in the Arctic Refuge. Each of these is a case where BLM's focus on energy dominance has overshadowed the agency's responsibilities to tribes. A silver lining of the Trump administration's pro-fossil fuel agenda is that it has highlighted many of the inherent problems with BLM's oil and gas leasing process that actually date back decades. From giving away leases for barely $2 an acre to being able to nominate lands anonymously and for free, BLM's leasing system prioritizes the desires of fossil fuel executives and the industry's bottom line above all else. It's time for Congress to hold the administration accountable, to restore the public's voice in leasing decisions, and address the unfair advantage that oil and gas companies receive when operating on public lands. Thankfully, Congressman Levin has taken a critical first step in achieving these goals by introducing H.R. 3225. This is common sense legislation that will help even the playing field and make fundamental changes to a system to more adequately protect taxpayers and public land users across the country. With that, I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses, and now I recognize the ranking member, Representative Gosar, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding, and thank all the witnesses for making their time today. I'm particularly pleased today to welcome Western Energy Alliance President Kathleen Sagama. She came a long way, and we're very happy that you made the trip, Kathleen. We're here today to discuss H.R. 3225, the so-called Restoring Community Input and Public Protections in Oil and Gas Leasing Act of 2019, sponsored by Representative Levin. This bill makes numerous amendments to the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920 and the Energy Policy Act of 2005, all of which are designed to make oil and gas leasing on federally owned land more difficult and to reduce domestic energy development. For example, this bill raises the royalty rates for onshore leasing from 12.5% to 18.5%, raises rental fees to $3 for the first 2 years of a lease, and $5 in all following years, and imposes fees to submit areas of interest for upcoming lease sales. The Secretary of Interior may also raise any of these fees or rates at any time without input from the public. While my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will likely argue that this will generate additional revenues to the Treasury and to the United States, in fact, these proposed policies will drive investment away from our federal lands. Rather than ensuring that the taxpayers receive their fair share from the extraction of federally owned hydrocarbons, revenues will fall as companies will likely opt out of doing business with federal governments altogether. We saw this yesterday in our markup all too well. This legislation will also codify several Obama-era mineral leasing policies, including the master leasing plans. The end result of these policies was clear by the end of the Obama administration. The BLM managed the lowest number of leases since 1985. Total leased acreage decreased by over 40%. Applications for permits to drill took way too long and averaged over 257 days. 166 million acres of federally owned land was off limits for development, and production on federal land lagged far behind the growing production on state and privately owned land. The Trump administration has taken several actions to correct these terrible policies and to reduce costs as well as encourage production on federal lands. Specifically, the Department of Interior has repealed or revised onerous regulations and taking several steps to streamline the oil and gas leasing and permitting process. Even so, in fiscal year 2018, federal lands contributed only 8% of all oil and 9% of natural gas produced in the United States. If we want to raise revenues for energy-producing states, we should focus on remedying the disparity in federal and non-federal energy production by adopting reforms under the Endangered Species Act and the National Environmental Policy Act, and reducing government red tape. We are currently experiencing an energy renaissance in this country. The U.S. now is a net exporter of energy for the first time in 65 years. Natural gas is more affordable than ever and is driving emission reductions across the country. Advances in technology and expanded developments of our onshore oil and gas resources has put energy independence within our grasp. Burdensome regulations that lock up our federal lands will not decrease demand for oil and gas resources. It will only worsen our dependence on foreign imports from places like Saudi Arabia and Russia. We have the best environment and labor standards in the world and an abundance of domestically available oil and natural gas. Rather than imposing additional burdens on our energy operators and additional costs on American households through legislation like H.R. 3225, we should be using the tools that we have to develop these resources here at home and prioritize providing affordable, reliable energy as well as creating American jobs. Again, I thank the witnesses for being here today, and with that, I yield back.
Testifying on our first panel today is Mr. Mike Ned. He's the Deputy Director of Operations for the Bureau of Land Management. Mr. Ned's testimony before this committee has become quite routine in the past. We see him frequently. So I imagine any explanation now of how the timer works in front of him is really not necessary. I might give it for the next group of panelists. Mr. Ned, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, and members of the subcommittee. I am Michael Ned, the Deputy Director for Operations for the BLM. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss H.R. 3225, the Restoring Community Input and Public Protection in Oil and Gas Leasing Act, which would amend the Mineral Leasing Act to make a number of adjustments in oil and gas leasing on federal lands. The department appreciates the subcommittee's interest in oil and gas development on the nation's public land, and we welcome the opportunity to work further with Congress on these important issues. However, the department cannot support the bill as currently written. The BLM manages approximately 245 million subsurface surface acreage located primarily in 12 western states, as well as over 700 million acres of subsurface mineral estate. The Federal Land Policy and Management Act set forth the BLM multiple use and sustained yield mission, directing that public lands be managed for a variety of uses, including conventional and renewable energy development, livestock grazing, conservation, mining, watershed protection, hunting, fishing, and other forms of recreation. Nationwide, the BLM has approximately 25.5 million surface acreage currently under leasing for oil and gas development, which includes 24,000 producing lease. Last year, federal lands generated in excess of $3 billion in federal revenue, of which the U.S. Treasury distributed nearly 50 or nearly half percent to the state, nearly half of that to the state where the oil and gas activity is occurring. In calendar year 2018, the BLM generated a record amount of revenue from lease sales, which was accompanied in part by streamlining administrative processes. The BLM has made it a top priority to responsibly develop the vast domestic energy resources on public land to create jobs, lower costs for working Americans, increase revenue to the taxpayer, and build a strong economy. As part of this effort, the Secretary issued several orders to reduce unnecessary and burdensome regulation while maintaining sound environmental protection and implementing certain improvements to the environmental review process. Contributing to our success in improving efficiency, the BLM has streamlined its Nepa processes, automated the leasing program, and utilized online competitive lease sales. This has allowed us to consistently offer lands for lease every quarter, which also shortened processing timeframes. H.R. 3225 would amend the Mineral Leasing Act by increasing the royalty rate and rental rates, removing non-competitive leasing, charging new fees for expression of interest, decreasing the frequency of lease sales, decreasing lease term length, and adding a number of complicated management requirements related to surface owners. The department believed that many of the bill's provision would reduce the competitive nature of the leasing process and could reduce revenues the BLM receive for leased public lands. We are also concerned that establishing substantially higher statutory minimum royalty rate and rental rates would discourage exploration and development on public lands. The BLM current online oil and gas competitive lease sale processes and auction format has increased bidding participation and led to greater competition at lease sales stage. In tandem with other streamlining effort, the BLM has demonstrated a successful functioning competitive lease process, generating a record-breaking $1.1 billion in lease sale revenue in the 28th lease sale BLM held in 2018. The department is committed to promoting responsible public land energy development that helps create and sustain jobs, promote a robust economy, and contributes to America's energy independence. We welcome the opportunity to work with the subcommittee to further these goals. Thank you for the opportunity to present this testimony. I will be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ned. I will remind the members of the committee that Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. Chair will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witness. I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Mr. Ned, I'm going to ask you a few questions in order. I'd really like on these questions very brief answers, and with, if you need to explain it, but briefly. First, did the new leasing policy that BLM issued in January of 2018 shorten any public comment or protest periods or make public notice and comment periods optional under any circumstances? Yes or no?
Thank you, Congressman. The process that was put in place exercises the secretary discretion for public comment period.
So does it, but the question is, and in that discretion, does it shorten any public comment or protest periods or make public notice and comment periods optional under any circumstances? Could it make those things optional?
It gives the discretion to the governing manager, so therefore public comments is optional in some cases, yes.
Thank you. And I assume that you're aware of the September 2018 court ruling blocking that policy in the greater sage-grouse habitat.
I'm aware of the court decision, Congressman.
In that ruling, the judge said, and I quote, "The record contains significant evidence indicating that BLM made an intentional decision to limit the opportunity for, and even in some circumstances to preclude entirely, any contemporaneous public involvement in decisions concerning whether to grant oil and gas leases on federal lands," and I end the quote from the judge. I believe that description applies to BLM's 2018 leasing policy across the country, not just in the sage-grouse habitat. Mr. Ned, does the BLM's 2018 leasing policy fulfill the public participation requirements of the National Environmental Protection Act, Policy Act, National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA?
Mr. Chairman, it does.
Well, the judge disagreed, saying in reference to NEPA, it strains common sense to see how these requirements are fulfilled. Mr. Ned, will BLM rescind its 2018 policy and fully restore public participation in the oil and gas leasing process?
As you may be aware, Mr. Chairman, the department that is currently in litigation, that order from the judge, and so until that litigation is over, I'm not at liberty to speak what the department will or will not do.
So you have this engagement with the judge does not indicate that they're not interested in rescinding the policy?
Mr. Chairman, again, the judge gave an order that the department is currently litigating, and we will comply with the order in Sage Grouse area, but until that litigation is over, I'm not in position to say.
Well, I just want to make it clear that by keeping this leasing policy in place, BLM's goal is to drastically reduce public input in oil and gas leasing. That's unfortunate, but honestly, it's not surprising. Let's change the topic, just I have 1 minute left. Former Secretary Zinke and others in the administration have repeatedly stated that shrinking Bears Ears by 85% was not about drilling or mining, but documents from BLM show that over 63,000 acres within the original boundaries of that had previously been nominated for oil and gas leasing. Has the department received oil and gas lease nominations for lands within the original Bears Ears boundaries?
Mr. Chairman, I don't have the exact details of where those nominations were. I know there were nominations within the Utah, within that vicinity, but I cannot speak to if it's exactly
Well,
in the
then,
boundary.
since you don't know, will you find out and then provide this answer in writing to this committee?
Be glad to, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Ned. I now... Oh, Mr. Lambert. I now recognize Mr. Lamborn for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad we're having this hearing. I have a different perspective on the job that BLM has been doing recently.
Really? What a surprise.
I want to applaud BLM. I think they are restoring common sense. They're reducing the bureaucracy and red tape. There's still way too much red tape, in my opinion, way too much litigation, slowing down common sense and responsible energy production in this country. This bill is ill-advised, I have to say. It would be so burdensome on energy production, it almost seems to me like a backdoor attempt to shut down energy production in the U.S. completely. Energy is helping make our economy boom. Just this morning, the S&P 500 hit an all-time high. And the Dow Jones and the NASDAQ are within 1% or so of reaching their all-time highs. Unemployment is at record lows. Wages are going up. So the economy is doing great in this country, and energy is a big part of that. The jobs that it produces and the lower cost to working families is really beneficial to our economy. And the thing is, if we shut down U.S. energy production, it just goes overseas to countries that are not environmentally responsible. Who wants to send more production for the world's energy needs to countries like Venezuela, Iran, Russia, Nigeria, all these other countries that don't have the kind of responsible energy regulations and environmental regulations that we have? I don't think that's a good idea. Now, the good news with this bill is it will never become law. The Senate would never pass it, and the White House would never sign it into law. So that's really the good news about this legislation. Even with getting rid of master MLPs, master leasing plans, which I think is a good move by the Bureau of Land Management, leased parcels still undergo 3 rounds of review under Nepa before production can even begin. So we still have very stringent environmental regulations and public input in place. Mr. Ned, I appreciate your testimony. Can you elaborate on why BLM canceled master leasing plans and how they were duplicative of what we already had?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, after it was implemented in 2010 and looking back, BLM realized that it was a process that would interject a level of NEPA that didn't lend any value when we get to the leasing stage. So between the planning stage and the leasing, there was a round of NEPA where we had public input. And even with trying to define that area of space, there was still a high number of protests. There was still a high number of objections that required additional NEPA. So it really didn't add any value. It took time, it took money, but didn't add any value.
Oh, thank you. So if it were to be reimposed, what would that do to energy and jobs in this country?
I can't speak specifically to energy, what it would do with a lot of detail, but again, it would interject a process that doesn't add value, and at the end of the day, we believe we would still be doing NEPA at the leasing stage and at the permitting stage.
Now, with some of the moves that BLM has done to streamline bureaucracy and red tape, what has this done for the timelines on lease sales and the APD backlog?
Well, on lease sales, we have moved from what used to be a sometime as much as 18 months now to a 6-month process, and as you said, we're still working to get better at that. In terms of APD, we have moved from over 253 days to about 170 days or somewhere thereof. Again, working very diligently to make certain we have public input and having some NEPA decisions.
And should this bill become law or a similar bill become law, what would the additional fees and royalties that it would require, coupled with the directive to reinstate these leasing policies that were just eliminated, what would that do to the otherwise positive impacts that BLM has accomplished with its latest streamlining efforts?
Yeah, Congressman, we believe it would have a significant impact where it would really curtail the exploration and the development of oil and gas on federal lands.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And before I call upon and recognize Mr. Levin, Mr. Ned, I'm glad that they brought up the APD. I would like you to let us know, can you provide for the committee the number of approved but unused APDs?
We can get that to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Levin for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Chair Lowenthal, and thank you to you and Mr. Grijalva for working with me to introduce this legislation. You know, scientists have overwhelmingly found that fossil fuel extraction has a dramatic impact on local communities. And all we're asking is for the public to be able to participate in the process, to have their voices heard. As Chair Lowenthal explained, my bill would do just that. By eliminating the Trump administration's actions that block public participation in oil and gas leasing decisions. Not allowing public participation, that's what's really ill-advised, with all respect. This bill would also protect taxpayers by eliminating non-competitive oil and gas leasing, requiring companies to pay a fee to nominate lands for leasing, and by raising the onshore oil and gas royalty rate, rental fee, and minimum bid amount. I'm pleased to see that many of our witnesses' written testimonies recognize the value of these changes. With that, I'll turn to questions. Mr. Ned, good to see you again. Under current law, could the Secretary of the Interior charge a company a cost recovery fee for submitting an expression of interest to the BLM? Yes or no?
Under current law, no.
My understanding is that actually the Secretary does have the authority under the Mineral Leasing Act and the Federal Lands Policy and Management Act to charge a company a cost recovery fee. Isn't that correct?
It is my understanding they can charge an administrative fee, and so, Congressman, cost recovery versus administrative fee has a distinct meaning, at least in the BLM context.
But they can't charge an administrative fee?
They can charge a fee, yes.
Okay, and are there examples where the Department of the Interior currently charges that type of fee for some type of energy-related activity on public land?
So, Congressman,
Perhaps I could give you some examples. Rights of way, processing certain activities related to fluid and solid minerals on public land.
There is a fee that is charged for the application for submitting the expression of interest. There is a fee, Congressman.
So last June, this subcommittee held a hearing on a bill that would have required the Interior Secretary to charge citizens that protest an oil and gas lease sale a fee. And I believe that Kate McGregor, who's the current acting deputy secretary, testified on behalf of the department at that hearing. Mr. Ned, do you recall if the Interior Department supported that legislation?
My understanding, Congressman, was Interior, yes.
They did, and here's a quote from Ms. McGregor's testimony at the time, and I quote, "The cost recovery draft may help reduce non-parcel specific protests by encouraging interested parties to more carefully consider protests and allow the BLM to conduct business in a more efficient manner. The BLM appreciates the subcommittee's work to address this issue," end quote. So let's go over the Interior Department's position, Mr. Ned. Interior could charge a fee for nominating lands for oil and gas leasing. Interior does charge similar fees in other scenarios, and Interior supports charging a fee to protest a lease parcel. But despite all this, it's your position that it would be completely unreasonable or too burdensome for the agency to charge oil and gas companies a fee for nominating lands in the first place. So I appreciate your honesty in answering the questions because I think it perfectly encapsulates this administration's priorities. The fossil fuel industry comes first, and public participation comes last. I want to quickly change gears. When was the last time the BLM adjusted its onshore oil and gas rental rate?
It is my understanding it has not been adjusted since the 80s.
1987. According to Taxpayers for Common Sense, the American public has been deprived of almost $30 million since 1987 because the rental rate has not been adjusted for inflation. Does BLM support adjusting the rental rate for inflation?
Again, Congressman,
Simple yes or no, Mr. Ned.
well, again, you asked a question, but I think the fees that combined together is what causes the issue in the oil and gas. So having a fee and adjusting that may not be an issue, but when you look at the totality of everything, that is where I think the issue comes in.
Mr. Ned, are you aware that under the bill that I mentioned, the Republican bill from last Congress that BLM testified in support of last June, the Interior Secretary would have been required to adjust the fee charged to citizens for filing a protest for inflation on an annual basis?
I'm not aware of that specific detail.
Well, I can assure you it's the truth. And again, you're helping make my point that this administration is more concerned with acting to advance the interests of fossil fuel industry rather than the public's interests. So your responses make it crystal clear why we need to advance this legislation and actually protect the public as much as you seem to want to protect the oil and gas industry. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Representative Levin. I now recognize the ranking member, Gosar, for 5 minutes of questions.
Oh, Mr. Ned, how are you doing?
Doing fine, Congressman, thank you.
Now, in your written testimony, you stated that the administration cannot support the bill as written, citing provisions that will reduce competitive nature of leasing process. One such provision is the directive to return to a sealed bidding process rather than the current competitive escalating bid auction process. How might this change in the bidding process impact participation in the leasing process? How would that do that?
Congressman, it would significantly change it. Right now, the escalating bid allows for competition. Going to a sealed bid would require some form of an assessment, whether it's a valuation or an appraisal or other tool. And so it would significantly change and create a burden on both the agency to make these lands available.
And typically, probably lower revenue. Is that true?
Generally, yes, Congressman.
Because sealed bidding actually tends to have lower return on investment. Mr. Ned, as you note in your testimony, the states receive 50%, actually 48%, of revenues generated on public lands for public services and programs. I also understand fiscal year 2018 was a record year for lease sale revenue. Can you tell us how much revenue was produced by energy leases on federal lands last year?
Revenue over $1 billion.
Were they record highs?
Say again?
Were they record?
Yes, there was.
So now this legislation also directs the BLM to conduct fewer lease sales per year than the law currently requires and increases fees and royalty rates on operators who produce on federal lands, all of which will reduce competition. If this bill is going to result in less participation in the leasing process, will this bill ensure that we continue to set record-setting revenues, or will it result in decreased revenues and less return to the taxpayer?
We believe it will result in decreased revenue and less revenue or less funding to the taxpayers.
So, once again, the idea that we see coming from this piece of legislation, once again, is trying to put the fossil fuels, and particularly the leasing on public lands, out of business. You know, they don't get it. I mean, we heard it again yesterday, over and over again, that the tax cuts didn't pay for themselves. The last time I looked, it was record-setting revenues that came in. So once again, we still don't get the economic impact. And seeing that this comes from California, the economics it's a net losing state of a number of people, because tax and spend only gets you so far. Do you see that this administration is overcompensating, or are they correcting the process that was put forward by the previous administration?
Again, Congressman, my view is the administration is attempting to have a process that allow the development of the resources in an environmentally sound manner as fast as we can. And so I don't want to comment whether they're correcting or overcompensating, but I think it's trying to have a process in place that makes sense.
Well, one of the things that we hear over and over again is during the Obama administration, we saw records set in the amount of revenues or production that came off of those public lands. It wasn't because of the federal government. It was because of the technology that came about from the private sector. Is that true?
We think technology plays a big part of that.
Oh, absolutely, because they slowed things way, way down. Now, I also, I keep hearing about this, the carbons being the biggest problem in regards to climate change and greenhouse gases. Did the United States lead the world in reductions of hydrocarbons and greenhouse gases in the last 15, 16, and 17 fiscal years?
There is article that suggests that, Congressman.
A lot of documentation that shows that, because we do it better than anybody else in the world, do we not?
In development energy resources, yes, we do.
And if we didn't do that here, we would be relying on actually folks that are much dirtier in their application and environmental assessment. Is that true?
That is my understanding, Congressman.
Mm-hmm. And so there's what we've actually seen is a dereliction of duty in regards to looking at these lease sales, intentionally harming the public. Is that true?
We believe it will have an impact, yes.
That this administration is duly trying to neglect public health?
We take the environmental studies and responsibility very seriously, and so we're making sound environmental decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I thank the gentleman and yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Representative Westerman for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ned. Seems like you're making regular appearances here. It must mean you're doing something, and I appreciate the efforts that you're making over at the agency, and appreciate you being back here to testify. When we talk about this idea of disclosing the identity of bidders before a lease sale, that may seem like a good, transparent thing, but also can have unintended consequences. And in your testimony, you stated that the surface owner provisions in Section 3 add some unnecessary steps to what's already a robust public notification process. Can you describe that current public notification process or those practices, and how that works throughout the whole lease sale process?
Yes, Congressman. And so through the lease sale process, and whoever nominates the lease certainly have a right to do it anonymously, and once a lease is issued, that information will become known. through the bidding system, we keep anonymous so that industry or market information would not be revealed. And once a bid or a parcel has been sold, then we will make the bidder's name available. Presenting that information beforehand would then, what we believe, it would release competitive information or bidding information that would make it less attractive.
Yeah, so, and the end result would be maybe what the intended purpose of the bill is. You'd have less people who would actually bid on these leases because of having to have that information released early on in the process. When you look at what this bill would do, what kind of extra resources, and including both staffing and funding, would DOI have to accommodate all the additional administrative requirements that are laid out in the bill?
Again, Congressman, we have not had an opportunity to do a detailed analysis, but we can tell it will take significant more resources.
And I would like to point out, and maybe the question is, do you agree with me that the bill does not specify how these administrative duties and requirements will be funded?
That is true.
Let's see. When we talk about the, trying to streamline efforts and also maintain environmental protections, the legislation directs the Secretary to reinstate the practice of implementing master leasing plans, or the MLPs, and anyone at the state and local level can request that the Secretary implement one of these plans. The BLM reviewed this practice and determined that it should be eliminated in your streamlining efforts. But even without the MLPs, how many opportunities are there for public comment and stakeholder engagement under Nepa before a parcel is leased or a drilling permit is issued? How much, in the current process, can you describe the opportunity for public comment and stakeholder engagement?
Yes, Congressman. By my count, there's at least about 5 or 6 opportunities for public participation. At the planning level, there's at the scoping level, there's public meetings. At the draft of a plan, there is an opportunity to comment. At the final of a plan, there's an opportunity to comment. And protests at the record decision level, there's an opportunity to protest. So again, just before the leasing, there's at least 5 or 6 at the leasing stage. Through the Nepa again, there's either scoping or public comment period. So there's at least 5, 6, depends on how many times you count it.
Yeah, and I will say that of the numerous individuals and businesses that I've talked to who have tried to get leases and worked through the process, I've yet to have a single person come to me and say, the process just went too fast and there wasn't enough scrutiny and transparency, and there wasn't enough public engagement in the process. And it seems like we're taking an issue that already is overburdensome and then trying to make it even more burdensome, which to me is just an effort to stop any kind of leases or mineral extraction off of federal lands. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, and I now recognize Mr. Cunningham for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Mr. Ned for appearing and testifying here today. I would like to yield back the balance of my time to the chairman.
Thank you. Now we're back on again. On March 11th of this year, Chairman Grijalva and I sent a letter to Secretary Bernhard requesting the enforcement data from BLM from the years between February of 2011 through March of 2019. So 2011 through 2019, February through March. The committee has followed up multiple times, but has not received the requested documents. When can we expect to receive these documents?
Mr. Chairman, one moment, please. My understanding is the departments are still working through that process, and
I understand that, but when can we expect to hear, to receive?
today I
these
don't have
documents?
an answer for you, Mr. Chairman, but I would be glad to take that back.
Thank you. That concludes our first panel, and I want to thank you, Mr. Ned, and you're now excused. Thank you again. Hope to see you soon, and we probably will.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members.
I'd like now the second panel to take their seats at the witness table.
Mr. Chairman, while they're doing that, Mr. Westerman's in the anteroom. It's 3-3 in terms of party participation. Let's just vote on the bill right now.
Are you dreaming? Is this a fantasy that you'd love to see happen? It's good. It's tough being in the minority.
That shows you that it's Colorado dreaming, not California.
Thank you, the new panel. Our first witness is Mr. Len Nessifer, an assistant professor at the University of Arizona and the founder and CEO of Natives Outdoors. Our second witness is Ms. Kathleen Sigama, the president of the Western Energy Alliance. Our third witness is Mr. Bruce Basil, the Energy Program Director at Earthworks. And our final witness is Mr. Pete Kolbenschlag, the Director of Mountain West Strategies. Now I have to give you the admonition that I did not have to give our annual or our usual guest, Mr. Ned, that I must remind you all as witnesses to limit your oral statements to 5 minutes, but that the entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the lights on the witness table will turn green. After 4 minutes, the yellow light will come on. Your time will have expired when the red light comes on, and I will ask you to please complete your statement. I will also allow the full panel to testify before questioning the first witness. The chair now I'm sorry, we're going to go through the panelists. The chair now recognizes Dr. Nessifer to testify.
Good morning, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, and members of the committee. I thank you for this opportunity to be here today to share my knowledge and experience of the broader impacts of energy development in Indian country. I also sit before you today to tell you my story with energy development in my home community. For decades, the environmental impacts of energy and mineral development on the Navajo Nation occurred unabated, with far too leniency with industry and with little concern for the broader consequences on communities like my own. Across Indian country, the BLM under the Trump administration has weakened public input and it has actively dismissed tribal nations, largely repeating the history of many of our communities that we're still recovering from today. I offer my support for the bill that's under consideration, and I thank Congressman Levin, the committee members, for their leadership on this legislation. She'e Lenesifer Yeneshia, na toa dene tachitni neshle, Scottish Bashis Chin do nake dene dashache do Romanian dashanale. My name is Len Nessifer. I am a member of the Navajo Nation. My introduction tells where I come from, who I represent, and most importantly, who I'm accountable to. I come from the Tobacco clan of the Tachitni people, and we trace our lineage back for millennia in the Southwest. And it's because of the environmental stewardship of my ancestors and others that we are able to enjoy our public lands today. I'd like to share part of the story that brought me here today. My grandfather, Henry Lee, was one of the thousands of Navajo men recruited to mine uranium on the Navajo Nation in the 1950s. As a child, I first learned about what the impact of uranium mining had on my community through what my grandfather called his tail. This tail was the tubes that ran across his face, down his back, to a portable oxygen tank that he carried everywhere. My grandfather lost his left lung to silicosis and struggled with respiratory illnesses for the rest of his life. In my opinion, poor government oversight, regulation, and a far too cozy relationship between regulators and industry contributed to what I see as an ongoing crisis in my community. My grandfather's condition was exacerbated by air pollution created by other energy development in the Four Corners region. I grew up a stone's throw from the Four Corners power plant, the Navajo mine, and oil and gas development on the San Juan Basin. Every winter, an inversion would form over my community, and I vividly remember being able to see the brown haze sit above my grandparents' house. I remember being able to taste the sour, acrid air, and I would get bronchitis every winter, and I thought that's what it meant to get a cold. I also saw my grandfather develop pneumonia with regular frequency, which eventually took his life. I pursued higher education because at first I was angry about this history, and then later I felt responsible about doing something about it. It was through this education that led me to take a job with the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs, where I worked directly with Native communities both in the lower 48 and Alaska on sustainable energy development. It was also during this period that a change in administration happened. Understandably, my task at DOE began to change, in my opinion, at the expense of Native people. The current administration's policy platform of energy dominance, which in my opinion is fossil fuel extraction at any cost to people and the environment, was a storyline I was all too familiar with. After 2 years of observing the patterns of BLM and other agencies fail to meaningfully engage tribes most affected by development, in my opinion, can be chalked up to avoiding input from communities with inconvenient perspectives and truths that inconveniences broader policy. I did not have a choice in the life or community or history that I was born into. I realize how much of these experiences, both personally and professionally, have informed my opinions today about current policies. I have seen how policy mistakes in my community and others have better informed policy management decisions today. However, I'm witnessing a decline back to practices that I think are inherently damaging to Native communities. It is clear our communities need to have meaningful consultation and their concerns adhered to when BLM is leasing on our lands and surrounding public lands. And it's even clearer that, in my opinion, BLM continues to drop the ball. The provisions in HR 3225 are a necessary first step to improving transparency and slowing down the rush to lease in the name of energy dominance. I encourage the committee to move to pass this legislation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Nessifer. The chair recognizes Ms. Sagama to testify for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just note that as I was working on the Royalty Policy Committee, which the Trump administration put together for the last 2 years, that the president of the Navajo Nation actually headed up a subcommittee and was very actively engaged in that effort in promoting oil and natural gas development on tribal lands, because it is such an economic driver and source of revenue for the tribe, including the Navajo Nation. I think my points were made earlier about why this bill is really not about restoring public participation. As Mr. Ned pointed out, the multiple rounds of Nepa and public comment. So I don't need to go into that, but it is in my written testimony as well. And I think that buttresses my point, which is that this bill is not about restoring community input. It's really about keeping it in the ground. There are certain things that we haven't even touched upon yet in this bill that would radically alter the way that leasing and development is done on federal lands. First and foremost, putting the subsurface subservient to the surface, and I detail out in my testimony why that system has been in place for many years, because simply the American people own the energy, the oil and natural gas beneath public lands. And so there's a reason that one landowner, one surface owner, cannot stop the development of the energy that all Americans own. So that's one important point about this bill, is that it upends that system. The second point is that, we already know from history why it is not effective to have the government supposedly setting a fair market value. The oxymoron of that is obvious. Actual markets set market rates. And what we have in the current leasing, lease sales system is that a market is at play and companies bid on tracts, And that's why we saw a $972 million record lease sale in New Mexico, because the Permian Basin is extremely productive now. It's one of the major reasons that the United States has surpassed Saudi Arabia and Russia as the #1 oil nation in the world. And that huge resource coming from the Permian Basin is highly competitive, and companies were bidding to extremely high. I think the highest bid rate was $81,000 per acre. And so that competition is reflected in the current lease sale system. So sealed bidding system or any kind of non-competitive system where the government attempts to determine fair market value, there's no way they would have set that at $81,000. It was that competitive lease sale. And as far as I know, the effort is underway to get rid of what's called the non-competitive aspect of the lease sale system. I think that's a misnomer. Those tracts come up, and if no one bids on them, the market has spoken that there's not a lot of interest in those areas. And if someone does come around and then put forward the minimum bid 2 years after the sale, it's because, well, the government at least gets some revenue from that, but it's highly unlikely that those areas will probably be developed unless somebody has a great idea, has done some geological research, and suddenly comes up with the next new play. And so that competitive system works for those marginal areas. And I guess my third point, I think Mike Ned made this already for the most part, but there's so many provisions in this bill that we don't even have time to get into today that would just severely burden the BLM and, really just tie up the agency with additional process. That's really about, again, keeping it in the ground, not about increasing community engagement. And I would just like to say, because Western Energy Alliance is involved in that litigation that was mentioned earlier in Idaho, that judge clearly was not following the letter of the law, and Mr. Ned was correct where the Nepa obligation was met. BLM is moving forward with that ruling and doing the additional public comment period in sage grouse area, but as far as I can tell, we're quibbling about 20 extra days, and that's about it. So anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to speak today and look forward to questioning.
Thank you, Ms. Sagama. I now recognize Mr. Basil for 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Gosar, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you on 3255. My name is Bruce Basil. I'm a resident of Durango, Colorado, and I'm the Energy Program Director for Earthworks. We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting communities and the environment from impacts of oil and gas development while seeking a just and rapid transition to renewable energy. Our Oil and Gas Accountability Project has worked in the West since 1998. In the early years, we specialized in protecting surface owners, mineral rights owners, and communities facing nearby oil, gas, and coal bed methane operations. Since then, the proliferation of directional drilling and hydraulic fracturing operations in shale has encroached upon additional communities, impacting health, climate, wildlife, air, water, and property. This bill helps deliver a more transparent and responsive oil and gas leasing process, in our view. We helped draft and negotiate provisions very similar to the requirements in Section 3 of this bill for Colorado and New Mexico in 2007 because industry's voluntary good neighbor policies failed to prevent conflict with surface owners. More than a decade of experience with that legislation since has shown that these basic surface owner notice and fairness protections work. Moreover, industry players such as BP in Colorado and the cattle growers in New Mexico were involved in the negotiation of these state requirements. So bringing what is standard practice in the states to the BLM context is not a big change and is more than timely. This bill requires notification of service owners at least 45 days in advance of lease sales underneath their property. After the sale, BLM shares with the surface owner the lessee's identity and stays in touch as additional lessee requests or as BLM decisions about modifying the lease arise. For truly good neighbors, many of the basic reforms contained in this bill reflect common courtesy as well as current state requirements. More responsible leasing procedures will also help mitigate potential conflicts, create greater efficiency, and reduce errors in environmental review and consultation practices. Fewer lease sales may provide BLM some relief from oil and gas industry pressure to rush additional acreage out for lease. In the San Juan Basin, where I live, and specifically the Chaco Canyon area, BLM's inadequate evaluation of lands under lease consideration and failure to conduct appropriate consultations with the Native American tribes and communities there has resulted in conflict and delays and increased costs. The administration also appears eager to limit the public's choice in our land uses for some of our nation's most treasured places through rollbacks of national monuments, reconsideration of mineral withdrawals, and pursuit of a so-called energy dominance strategy. Our government seems bent on taking back public minerals from public hands and placing them in private industry hands. This approach has backfired, where the rushed lease decisions become poor decisions. Just yesterday, the Government Accountability Office announced they will investigate whether the Trump administration violated the law when identifying tracts for oil and gas leasing in the former Grand Staircase Escalante Monument. Similarly, federal courts in Washington, D.C., Montana, and elsewhere have sent BLM back to the drawing board when giving unlawfully short shrift to their climate analysis of leasing. This reform bill codifies an important instruction to BLM to provide the public input and environmental review that NEPA requires. This legislation acknowledges the reality that the oil and gas industry is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, NEPA reviews must include life cycle analysis of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. Some courts are already recognizing this trend, and if BLM fails to recognize this, they increase the risk of more lease delays. In conclusion, I appreciate Mr. Levin's leadership on this bill and hope that the subcommittee will support it in future votes. We do support bringing these common sense reforms to BLM's oversight and regulation of oil and gas leasing so that it is comparable to what major oil and gas producing states have done for the last decade. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Basil. I now recognize, or the chair now recognizes, Mr. Kolbenschlag to testify. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member Gosar and the subcommittee for taking my testimony today. My name is Pete Kolbenschlag. I come from Western Colorado, the North Fork Valley in Delta County. I'm here to support H.R. 3225 and believe it's a bill that would help fix a broken oil and gas leasing system to better provide transparency, to better protect American taxpayers, and to safeguard our public lands, our waters, and our wildlife. I'm here to address issues that rural communities like mine have in attempting to engage in the oil and gas leasing process, and that we often face challenges getting our voices heard by the Bureau of Land Management. Thankfully, H.R. 3225 seeks to address some of these challenges. The North Fork has always been known for its orchards and farms. The ditch I live on has water rights dating back to 1893, and as anyone who knows the West knows, those water rights are a precious thing. The valley's heritage is in agriculture, and its oldest enterprise was bringing irrigation water to it. We also have been a coal mining town since the early days, and we have a history of not only feeding America, but helping to power it too. And that's a heritage that we are proud of in that valley. I'm honored to speak here today to provide my input on this comprehensive energy reform legislation and to bring insight from my little community of a few thousand people in rural Colorado. I'm here on my own behalf, but I'm carrying the input from many. In order to succeed, we need to have our voices heard, and we need the opportunity to fully engage in land use decisions that affect our lives, our heritage, and our livelihoods. So I'm here to support H.R. 3225 because it would benefit communities like mine. The management decisions on public lands are critically important to the economies and to the livelihoods of those that live in the valley that they surround. Where and how mineral leasing and development happens has outsized impacts on our clean air and water, on our wildlife, and ultimately on the growing economies like outdoor recreation, tourism, and an evolving agricultural industry that are the future in our valley. This vital link between the health of the valley and the public lands management is not new. In 1904, a report from the then Gunnison Forest Reserve officials wrote, "The value of the forest as a protection cover is clearly shown by the experiences of the people of the North Fork Valley. Several years ago, the ditches which drew their supply from the North Fork became very short. This expensive object lesson thoroughly convinced the farmers and fruit growers of the importance of forest cover to prolong stream flow, and it seems unnecessary to give further evidence in this report." The North Fork's largest agricultural association, the Valley Organic Growers Association, supports H.R. 3225. VOGA represents over 120 family farms and livestock ranchers. Its memberships run from multi-generational to young farmers just starting out, and allowing for their meaningful engagement on local public lands and their water supply is what their predecessors have been doing for 100 years in that valley. H.R. 3225 reforms are also important to protecting our emerging economies. The North Fork is called Colorado's farm-to-table capital. We have the highest concentration of organic and sustainable farms and ranches, and it's one of only 2 federally designated wine grape growing regions in the state. The wineries and the markets, the agritourism farms, they all expect a federal government that actively seeks out and considers their input prior to making decisions that could so greatly impact them, which is why the West Elk Winery Association also supports H.R. 3225, and I've submitted their comments for the record. These public lands are not only the backdrop and the foregrounds to our businesses that trade on that quality, but are themselves prized and productive in supporting a multi-million-dollar recreation economy. In the 3rd Congressional District, where I live, it's over $2 billion annually, according to the Outdoor Industry Association. These public lands include some of the most sought-after hunting units in Colorado. Hunters and guides who care about recreation on public lands need the opportunity to field check these lease sales prior to them being put up for bid. In the last 10 years, the BLM has attempted to offer leases. Here are some examples of why public comment's important. Under the Pay on Your Reservoir Dam, and a couple hundred feet uphill from the water well on private property supplying an adjacent winery on the steep barren slopes around the high school's athletic field. The BLM even tried to lease highly erodible, selenium-rich shales where the agency itself was part of a multi-jurisdictional task force saying, "Don't lease these lands." Luckily, those lands were not leased because public comment at the time allowed for more input. Agency staff as well as local citizens were able to provide that input and have those leases deferred. That is the type of respect we are asking for in rural communities in America. Thank you for introducing this legislation. I urge the committee to support it.
Thank you, Mr. Kolbenschlag. I want to thank the panel for their testimony. Again, I want to remind the members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chairman will now recognize members for any questions that they may wish to ask witnesses. I recognize Mr. Levin for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our witnesses for their testimony this morning. As I mentioned earlier, the bill's intent is to restore public input rules created under the previous administration. Mr. Kolbenschlag, can you explain how public lands are integral to many facets of rural economies in western Colorado, and how oil and gas leasing that does not adequately incorporate public input could jeopardize the way of life for your community?
Our public lands are critically important, and they're very loved. We're very fortunate in the North Fork Valley to have lands managed by the Interior Department, both BLM and Bureau of Reclamation lands and facilities. We have a number of Forest Service lands that are, I believe, some of the most beautiful backcountry on the planet, and we cherish those lands. As I mentioned, all of our water supply comes from the National Forest. Our irrigation works, our water conveyances, ditches, and the like all cross BLM lands. There's been cases in the past where BLM tried to lease lands that they actually were not allowed to because the Bureau of Reclamation controlled lands along ditches, and it was only because of, at the time, more robust comment period that allowed for those comments and those federal agencies to provide data to their own sister agency to help get those setbacks on those leases, and the leases eventually were deferred altogether because they're founded on a 1989 resource management plan that perhaps people were able to comment on 30 years ago, but certainly most people in the Valley don't think that our current appreciation of the public lands, the current values they provide, are captured in a 30-year-old land use plan. And so for all intents and purposes, we view that plan worthless as far as being able to actually be counted on as any kind of public input. So obviously recreation is a huge issue on the public lands. As I mentioned, it's a $2 billion industry in the 3rd Congressional District. These are some of the most prized hunting units in Colorado. They're the kinds of hunting units that people come from all over the United States and even world to draw tags for elk and deer primarily. It is a huge input to our economy like it is to all rural economies. The orange banners go out during hunting season. It provides a huge and tremendous economic boost to our Main Street businesses as well as to outfitters who have been guiding people on these lands. There's grandsons that come back with grandfathers who have been hunting multi-generationally on these lands. They come from all over the U.S. So these lands are critically important to us. They're also just the scenic backdrops to the wineries and we have 15 wineries there. It's a growing industry. It's very important to our state and it's very important to our region. People don't go to a winery to look at well pads, to look at compressor stations, to look at roads carving across their public lands.
Could you expand for me on the benefits of shortening the BLM lease terms from 10 years to 5 years?
Absolutely. That's a very important reform. With all due respect to some of the earlier comments, speculative leases are not just, they don't just hang out there and probably won't get developed. They create tremendous business uncertainty for our economic drivers in the Valley. Lands that are leased for oil and gas development, even lands that are unlikely to be developed, preclude other resource management decisions that land agencies might be reluctant to engage in because these lands are under a lease and under an obligation. So shortening the lease term is hugely important to making sure that current information is always being considered prior to putting these lands up for such a impactful activity.
Thank you, Mr. Kolbenschlag. Mr. Bazel, in your written testimony, you mentioned that both Colorado and New Mexico, which are significant oil and gas producers, have similar regulations mandating transparency and landowner protections. Can you identify some of the ways that this bill, H.R. 3255, overlaps with state requirements, and what does this overlap suggest about the argument that this bill would somehow drive oil and gas production off federal lands?
Thank you. Thank you for the question, Congressman. To answer your question, I don't think it will have any impact because it will just put them as comparable to what's required off of federal lands. I looked at the Section 3 requirements and I thought, somebody copied the New Mexico statutory provision we passed in 2007 called the Surface Owners Protection Act. Those provisions are almost identical. The inclusion of accommodation language is straight from the Colorado statute, which requires an oil and gas producer to accommodate to the fullest extent possible the uses of the surface owner. So very, very similar.
Thank you, and I'm out of time, but I appreciate your testimony and working with us on this important legislation.
Thank you. And I now recognize Mr. Lambourne for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, for yielding, and I appreciate your leadership. As I said earlier, the U.S. economy is booming. Just today, the S&P 500 hit an all-time high. The Dow Jones, the NASDAQ are close to all-time highs. Unemployment is at record lows. Wages are going up. And energy is a big part of our economy in this country. So I'm concerned about what this bill, fortunately, it is dead on arrival. It will never become law. But should it become law, I'd be really concerned what it would do to our economy and energy in particular. So, Ms. Sagama, I have several questions for you. I would like to note for the record, 3 of our 4 witnesses are from Colorado, and I think that's great. I welcome everybody, and all 4 witnesses, actually. But, Ms. Sagama, I've got several questions for you. One thing in the proposed legislation is that it would decrease the length of typical lease terms from 10 years to 5 years. What would that do?
Well, it's almost impossible to operate on a federal lease within 5 years because there's so much additional process. So your Nepa, I haven't tracked it recently, but during the Obama administration, Nepa documents were taking about 8 years in many cases. So the government itself was an obstacle to actually operating on those federal leases. And so a 5-year lease term simply isn't long enough. And I would just like to point out that all a lease does is confer a right to develop the subsurface. It does not preclude, as was stated earlier, any other uses of the land. And in fact, we're compatible with recreation, hunting, farming, agriculture, ranching. So, a lease, especially if it's not developed, obviously, but it doesn't preclude other uses. And that's the multiple use mandate of BLM, and the system works.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Another thing I'm concerned about is that the bill would reduce the number of required lease sales per state to 3 times a year rather than quarterly, and would require each BLM office to hold only 1 sale per year. How would this impact leasing and access to federal lands?
Well, that rotating system ended up in such a manner that very prospective areas such as the Permian Basin in New Mexico or northwestern Colorado would only be able to come up once a year. And areas that really there's not a lot of activity would occupy one of the 4 lease sales, and so you'd have lease sales with no leases. So it wasn't a very efficient manner. If you were going for a prospective area and you didn't catch the timing right on the lease sales, you could wait another whole year to have those areas come up. So it's just not an efficient way to respond to what the market's actually doing.
Okay. And I'd like to point out that there is a sharp disparity in the level of production on federal lands versus non-federal lands. What would this legislation do with that disparity?
That's a good point. Certainly, federal production is up, but it still lags far behind adjacent non-federal lands. Because of the additional process on federal lands, and like I said, it can take years and years before you're even able to apply for a permit, the federal lands are already non-competitive with non-federal lands. So by adding more red tape onto federal lands, it simply continues to decrease their competitiveness. Now, in the West, with the checkerboard pattern of land ownership and mineral ownership, even if you're trying to primarily operate on non-federal lands, you're going to hit some federal minerals, especially with our long laterals now with horizontal drilling. So you can't totally avoid federal minerals, how hard you may try. So just gumming up the system with more red tape, as this bill does, would really upset that balance that we do see on federal lands, which is, of course, we recognize there should be more protection and more process on federal lands because they're lands that all Americans own. But there are also oil and natural gas resources that all Americans own. So there has to be a balance between the level of regulation and actually being able to move forward and develop on them. And this bill would vastly upset that balance.
It's my perspective that this bill is so onerous with additional regulations that it's really a backdoor attempt just to shut down energy production on federal lands. Would you agree with that or not?
I don't think I was very reticent in my testimony at all. I think this is a keep it in the ground bill, yes.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Huffman for 5 minutes of question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciated my friend Mr. Lamborn's opening comments about the economy and the stock market. All of us are delighted that the Obama recovery has continued at the same steady pace that it did for 7 years under the previous administration. Dr. Nesfer, I want to start with you. I understand that you visited the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and have visited with native communities that rely on the coastal plain, protection of that coastal plain for subsistence, specifically for hunting of the porcupine caribou herd. How would oil and gas leasing in the Arctic Refuge affect these communities, and has the BLM fulfilled its tribal consultation obligations required by law?
To answer that second piece, I would, in my opinion, no. My work in the Arctic Refuge, I was there last week meeting with the Gwich'in communities, and it's, I think, beginning to talk about the importance of the land and the protection of the environment is critical for these communities to live. Many Gwich'in communities rely on up to 80% of their food comes from the land, and one of the pieces that is the alarms that are being sounded in these communities is that oil and gas development on the coastal plain threatens the basic livelihoods of these communities and will, in their opinion, kill them. And this is a very serious threat to their well-being, and I don't believe that the BLM has seriously considered this.
Well, in fact, don't we see similar impacts to tribal communities elsewhere due to heavy extractive industries and a federal government that, because it is captive to the oil and gas and mining industries, has little regard for the health and well-being of Native Americans?
I would agree. I have asthma as a result of that.
Is the Trump administration's energy dominance agenda about helping tribes develop their own energy resources, as some would contend, or is it more about exploiting disadvantaged groups for the benefit of fossil fuel and mining interests?
I think if that was the case, there would be a number of reforms on double taxation in places like North Dakota with some of the tribes there, but I haven't seen yet to see that.
All right, I want to ask you about your own experience. You mentioned in your written testimony that one of the reasons you left the Department of Energy in 2017 was because you were forced to remove references to climate change from your work. That work involved investigating how to support Alaska Native communities most directly impacted by climate change. The Trump administration didn't want you to talk about these things, but we're certainly going to give you a chance to do that, and I appreciate that you're here. So please describe for us some of the ways that tribal communities would be impacted by climate change, and how would you recommend that the federal government incorporate this information into its fossil fuel leasing program?
So part of the work that I was tasked with doing was interviewing leaders in Alaska Native communities about their reliance on fossil fuels and ways in which renewable energy could support traditional and customary hunting on their lands. We interviewed over 40 leaders from across the state, and one of the common themes that came out from those interviews were the real and dire impacts that were occurring from climate change. Some of them from villages like Shishmaref and Kivalina, where these communities literally have to move. Their entire villages are falling into the ocean. And the question of climate change is not a debate in many of these communities. They're seeing it firsthand with how animals' behaviors are changing, how they're losing their fresh water supplies on the coast. And in reality, these need to be considered in any sort of larger leasing plan of the broader impacts of climate change from carbon that will be released from oil and gas development on federal lands.
Appreciate your testimony. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Huffman. The chair now recognizes Mr. Westerman for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to this panel of witnesses as well. Mr. Klobenschlag, as you gave your testimony, there were several issues where I think you and I would agree, and I was nodding my head about what you were talking about, forest and clean water. You were talking about view sheds, and I'm not much of a wine drinker, but I could picture people sitting on the patio drinking their wine with the forest in the background. And when we look at minerals and energy, and you think about the area affected in a forest, it's a relatively small area compared to the overall forest. And I've heard, and we even had testimony last Congress from foresters in Colorado that said there's actually more trees dying in Colorado than growing. The forest is in decline. So I just did a quick Google search on Gunnison National Forest Health, and I found this article from Colorado State that was a survey of 2000, in 2015. It was published in 2016. And just some highlights of it, it says, spruce beetle outbreaks caused widespread tree mortality for the 4th consecutive year. Said infestations were detected on 409,000 acres across the state, expanding into 182,000 acres of previously unaffected forest. Blowdown events combined with long-term drought, stress, warmer temperatures, and extensive amounts of older dense spruce have contributed to this ongoing epidemic. It talked about defoliators of coniferous trees like the spruce budworm and the Douglas fir, tussock moth, another 312,000 acres infected there. And it goes on, talks about the mountain pine beetle. So there's some serious forest health concerns there that would definitely affect those watersheds and affect those viewscapes. And if you start looking at why those forests haven't been managed, a lot of that, I believe, is because of an overburdensome Nepa process that allows sound forest management plans to be stopped. So when we look at overall forest health, do you think we need to work on Nepa as well so that we can do more science-based forest management to make these forests healthier so that we can improve watersheds and viewscapes?
Thank you, Congressman. Certainly, I think science is very important when it comes to understanding forest health. Fortunately, on what we call the GMUG, which is an administrative unit, the Grand Mesa Uncompahgre Gunnison Forest, it's actually the largest administrative unit in Colorado, so it's a huge forest. Fortunately, in the North Fork, we do not have that level of tree mortality yet, but yes, forest health is critically important. Yes, it needs to be driven by science.
So I sometimes wonder if we would focus our efforts more on, looking out for the health for the total forest, and we've got 193 million acres of federal timberland in our country, and the Forest Service tells us somewhere around 80 million acres of that is currently subject to catastrophic wildfire, that we could do a whole lot more for water and wildlife and recreation and viewscapes and all the benefits we get from healthy forests, including clean air and clean water. But when we look at this particular bill, Ms. Sagama, I think you talked earlier about fair market value, and the bill leaves it to the discretion of the Secretary to determine what fair market value is. That does seem like an oxymoron. How would this work? How do you think it would actually play out if it was the Secretary's discretion to take in bids and determine if there was fair market value there? Because isn't fair market value what the market's willing to pay for something?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty common definition. So I think we know what it would look like because we have history to show us. Before the 1987 reform of the Mineral Leasing Act, it's estimated that about 90% of leases were sold below market value because the government was setting market value. So when you actually let a lease on a competitive market, surprise, surprise, if it's in an area like the Permian again, where we had that record lease sale of $972 million, those bidding prices were, frankly, astonishing, up to $81,000 an acre. So that's what fair market value really is, the actual market setting it.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. My first question is for Mr. Basil. My understanding, Mr. Basil, is that anyone, regardless of any knowledge, any experience, or expertise, can anonymously nominate a parcel of federal public land for BLM to lease, which in my understanding, BLM almost always obliges. Then if that lease parcel does not sell at a competitive auction, then anyone can purchase the lease for just $1.50 per acre, even if she or he has no intention of developing it. Based upon your experience, is this system an efficient way of determining which lands are best suited to be leased and which lands are most likely to result in royalty-generating oil and gas production?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A slight correction there. I think the law requires that you have the intent to develop, and they've prosecuted actually an environmental activist over that very issue.
Because they did not have, quotes, an
Well, that was the
intent to-
claim, but in my experience, there are also a number of what I would call middlemen who package up leased acreages and then try to sell those to the operators who will actually develop. And that's, so you have big operators, they know where they want to go, they've got the geologists, but you also have a subset of independent contractors that go out and package these up, and they're basically speculating that they'll be able to flip those and sell them to the actual operator. So it's not a very efficient system, and it really isn't a true market in that sense because of the lack of transparency, in my opinion.
All right, so then would this system that you've just described and kind of corrected us exactly what is in the system be improved as the bill proposes, where entities identify themselves before nominating a parcel and demonstrate that they are actually capable of developing the leases they wish to purchase? They must demonstrate that?
Certainly, in general, the public would benefit from that. I would say that the surface owners that will be dealing with the operator who has leased a parcel would especially benefit. You need to know who your neighbor is going to be, who you're going to be dealing with for 20 years. That's a very important thing. The sooner you can find that out, the better you're off you are in terms of your planning about how that might impact your cattle operations, your dairy, your alfalfa growing, as in southeast in the Permian. So absolutely, it would be a benefit.
So that you know the system would be improved by what the bill proposes there. Additionally, HR 3255 requires the BLM to charge companies a cost recovery fee. We've already heard that. When they nominate lands for leasing. What would you say are the benefits of charging an expression of interest fee like this?
In budget-constrained times, agencies need to cover their costs, and in fact, several states are looking at that very change in either regulation or statute to assess a fee for the actual application, New Mexico included in that, because they are not covering their costs. I think it also serves as a filter to keep out those who are not really serious about developing. If you have to put some money up front, you get some skin in the game, then you're showing that you're committed. And if you don't have to pay that upfront fee, then it's easy to just put some paper in and try to hold it that way without any skin.
Thank you. Mr. Kolbenschlag, why do you think the BLM under this administration is trying to cut the public out of the leasing process, or at least drastically reduce the public's input in the leasing process, and make it harder for the views of local citizens in energy-producing states to be incorporated into land management decisions? Is this an attempt to silence people?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe it is. I believe that the community I come from, that sentiment is widely shared. That, if I may give a brief example, our local town council meets every 2 weeks. And so having a lease comment period that's so short basically cuts out that grassroots governance because the town council can't comment, and that's unfair.
Thank you, and I yield back. This is Mr. Graves for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you all for being here today. First of all, so we're talking about a few different things here. We're talking about, one, the public's ability to be able to participate and provide comments and input, right? Everybody agree? Two, we've got an issue on just kind of energy portfolio of this nation and making sure that we're pursuing truly an all of the above energy strategy. Is that fair with renewables and everything? Is that fair, that that's kind of part of this discussion to some degree? And one of the other issues that's come up has been this whole issue on, let's make sure that we're making informed decisions about the public's input and the adjacent neighbor's input, informed decisions about what the recoverable reserves are. Let's not go in and go do this type of production operations if it's not really worth it, meaning, to the community and to the taxpayers. Is that fair? I mean, is that kind of framing up some of the discussion today? So going through a leasing process, you have numerous opportunities for the public to comment. It's not just one, it's numerous. Now, the concern I think I heard you just talking about is that it would actually be shorter. So there'd be a shorter time period, but you still have multiple ones. I guess what I'm trying to figure out here is a few different things. So if we end up coming in and we pass this bill, right now, the law requires, the Energy Policy Act 2005 requires that you ensure a fair return to the United States, so market value fair return. If we end up coming in and restricting domestic energy production, Chairman loves when I make reference to this. I make reference to it almost every hearing because it's fun. We had a witness that came here and said that when you stop producing energy in the United States, what it does is it doesn't force you to renewables or other sources. What it happens is it increases your dependence upon foreign energy. Your states get 50% of the revenue. Thank you. Good point. 48% because 2% goes to administrative costs now, but 50% of the revenue is diverted to under the Minimum Leasing Act to share with those states. So what happens if we stop producing domestically or reduce it? It increases our reliance upon foreign energy, and our states have reduced revenue sharing, which goes back into their budgets for infrastructure and environmental programs and other things. There are trade-offs here. Does that make sense that there are trade-offs? Secondly, do you believe, as this bill does, that we should actually do a technical and economic feasibility study for the development and production before we actually start producing these lands? Do you think that this bill proposes that? Congressman Levin's bill proposes that. Do you think that's appropriate? Any of you? It's appropriate to do, basically it says to do a technical and economic feasibility study. Let's look at it, figure out if it's recoverable, how much it is, if it's worth it. Does that make sense for us to do that before we were to go through leasing? What's that? It depends. Could you expand? I mean,
I think one of the things that I look at and consider is in looking at the communities impacted, it's a trade-off of where are we prioritizing development near communities that may already have potential, it may expose higher levels of air pollution, but I think what's at hand is basically, do we go full throttle with oil and gas development, or do we do this in a sound way considering the science? And I think we're not doing that.
Right, but science is data. Science is, hey, how big is this reserve? Is it really worth it? Are we going to go through and potentially have adverse impacts without understanding how much is actually even recoverable? How much money, how much energy? Is it natural gas, which is cleaner, or other sources? I mean, don't you think all that should be taken into consideration before we make decisions? Figure out what is the trade-off here, right?
And I think for sciences like the
Can I get a yes or no? I mean, does that make sense for us to get that data?
Yes, and that's why RMPs are so contentious, because they haven't been updated.
Okay, all right. So you believe that should be applied. Doctor, earlier, my friend Mr. Huffman was talking about climate change and talking about impacts. Do you think that we should be mitigating for the impacts of climate change?
Can you explain what you mean by mitigation?
Helping, you brought up Shishmaref and Kivalina, the two places I've been to several times. Do you think we should be making investments in helping to make those communities more resilient?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. So, the thing that just drives me crazy about being here, number one, just yesterday, we proposed numerous amendments to actually say, hey, look, before we take these areas and say, hey, they're off limits, let's do an assessment and figure out what it is we're talking about. Everybody opposed it. We did amendments trying to put money, dedicate money for resilience, for restoration, for areas like coastal Alaska, coastal Louisiana, coastal Florida. Every single one of those was rejected. It's really fascinating to see just this whole hypocrisy that happens here. It happens every single day in this committee. It's amazing. So I believe we should. I believe we should do assessments, just like this bill says. I believe that we should be investing in mitigation for these communities, like in Alaska, like in coastal Louisiana, Florida, and other coastal communities, and in California. These are the right things to do, and we try and provide opportunities, and when we do it, because of the partisan nature of this place, it gets shut down. When they do it, it's great policy.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. I hope then you'll become a co-sponsor of the bill. Next, Mr. Hearn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Republican Leader Gosar, I really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. It appears that this bill, and certainly in my opinion, and I think many on this side, that this bill is nothing more than an attempt to codify the Obama-era leasing policies to discourage oil and gas to be drilled. Ms. Sagami, you referenced the permitting period taking a long time to be permitted on federal lands. And in fact, the drilling on federal lands has lagged pretty significantly behind private lands to your testimony, and I think it just bears out the facts that when you look at them. And in spite of all this, my friends on the other side would love to completely get rid of the fossil fuel. They've made no bones about that. That's what they want to do. The consultation requirements, the costs, the fees, and the royalties. And so, you know, we've heard a lot of testimony on this, and there's no question what's going on and what's trying to get their arms around what President Trump and his administration are trying to do in making us energy dominant around the world. We're not dependent on foreign oil, as my colleague from Louisiana just referenced, and has referenced many times the trade-off that we've seen in the harm that is done with shipping oil into our areas, and a lot more liabilities that go on with that. Ms. Sagama, as the president of the Western Energy Alliance, you have a great deal of expertise on the effects that policy plays in energy development, and because of this, I'd ask you about duplicative reviews under the current Nepa system. As you know, currently there are 3 rounds of review under Nepa before production can begin. This legislation seeks to add a 4th round of reviews to this process as well as was implemented by the Obama administration. Under that administration, this process only resulted in further delays without any of the intended benefits. This is why the Trump administration rightfully did away with this 4th round of review. Can you please explain to this committee how detrimental it would be to oil and gas development on federal lands if this 4th round of review was put back into place?
Well, I think you've pretty much articulated it. It's just another round of NEPA and you know, it's a minimum of 3 layers of NEPA. Often there are programmatic and supplemental layers of NEPA. You can end up doing 2 layers of NEPA for any one well pad. So it's a minimum of 3, 4, 5 rounds of NEPA, each with public comment. And when you look at the RMP stage, multiple rounds of public comment, leasing stage public comment, project level NEPA public comment. So the public absolutely should have a role in commenting on how their energy is developed, and they do. And, you know, so adding in another layer of NEPA through the master leasing plan process just simply prolongs those time periods. And I would point out that what's in the bill is even more broad and far-ranging than previous, because any one citizen could ask for an MLP. So you'd have this situation where just you could ask for an MLP and then ask for another MLP and another one and another one. It's just a way to protract and extend that time frame again.
Thank you. Another question I have for you is about the actions under the Trump administration to expand energy development on federal lands. In fiscal year 2017, federal lands contributed 7% of all oil, 9% of natural gas, and 6% of natural gas liquids produced in the United States. Because of these low percentages, the administration has taken several actions to encourage production on federal lands, including the practice of holding quarterly oil and gas leases, sales, revising the venting and flaring rule, and rescinding the hydraulic fracturing rule. Could you please explain in our limited time here how these actions can help energy production on federal lands?
I think it's just getting the regulatory system back in line with, you know, back to that balance. There absolutely should be more process and more regulation on federal lands. There already is. But what the Obama administration tried to do was use regulations punitively and to try to stop development. And so the Trump administration has overturned not the bedrock environmental laws that we always comply with. I mean, there are thousands of regulations when it comes to developing on federal lands. But just pare back some of them that were just meant to add red tape without addressing any real environmental benefit. The hydraulic fracturing rule is a case in point. States already regulate hydraulic fracturing. BLM's regulations were redundant with what states were already doing, and so the Trump administration rightly pulled back that additional regulation.
Thank you. It seems very sensible. People protecting the peoples in a balanced and fair way. Thank you so much for your time. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Hearn. The chair finally now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Gosar, for 5 minutes of questioning.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Basil, my wife is actually from Durango. And to Mr., how did you say his name? Klobuchar? Klobuchar. I have family over in Delta. So I'm very aware of the situation. I just wish that Mr. Westerman would have asked Mr. Basil the same questions he asked you, because I'm very aware of the beetle kill that is around Durango. And why I bring that up is because of the mismanagement of the forest. You know, I sit over there in Arizona with the largest ponderosa forest in the country. And we have a tinderbox ready to go, because what we've done is we've sued our way out of mismanagement. So that's kind of leads me into my question, is that, Ms. Sagama, in regards to this, any of these things can actually be extended by, on the 23rd hour, 59th minute with a stamp and a letter. Is that true?
I'm not quite sure I understand what you're getting at
So
there.
anything can be extended based upon dissertation by any interest group extension by a letter certifying, saying, listen, extended times, a possible lawsuit.
Well, I mean, every round of Nepa, there's the opportunity to sue to stop oil and natural gas development. We've seen that is the strategy of the environmental lobby now, is to sue on pretty much everything. So that's always an option.
Yeah, so part of the problem is that what we see with the Trump administration is they've seen this degradation in process, extending that process, and they're trying to get it back closer to what state jurisdiction is as well. Is that true? More of a competitive type of being in the game.
That's right. I think the Trump administration is listening to states. They've certainly realigned several issues, even at the EPA, to be more in line with that cooperative federalism and working with the states.
And do you see, from your standpoint, any ilk to bypass any of those environmental obligations?
I mean, there's so many stringent environmental obligations that we have when we operate on federal or non-federal lands. What the Trump administration has been trying to do is get rid of some of the regulations that were, A, not in line with the actual law, the underlying law, but B, get rid of some of the and the venting and flaring rule from 2016 is one example of that, where it went well beyond BLM's jurisdiction and authority and had BLM regulating air quality, which is the job of the states, the tribes, and EPA. So part of it is getting regulation back in line with the law, and the second part is just that balance of not using red tape to stop oil and natural gas production in the United States, because it just sends it overseas.
Now, in regards to fines and leasing, most of these reservoirs or major plays are pretty well known. Is that true?
To some extent, but, 5 years ago, we didn't know how productive the Permian was, and it wasn't.
You knew it was there, though.
Yeah, but we didn't know how to get to it necessarily.
There you go.
And, the Mancos Shale in northwestern and western Colorado, northwestern New Mexico and western Colorado is very perspective, and we're cracking the geology on that as well. So there are still areas and formations that we continue to exploit in a better way. You look at the Bakken in North Dakota 15 years ago, we knew there was a lot of oil there. We didn't know how to get it, and now we continue to go after other rock formations in that same area.
I guess my point is how many middlemen do you actually see making a lease and then bundling it to the big boys?
Well,
It's not a very prevalent
Well, I mean,
scheme.
there are lease brokers who provide a service in the leasing stage. There absolutely are. Now, there are some, we've seen some bad actors in Nevada in particular, where they're not doing any geophysical analysis, but just nominating acreage. But that's a special case, that's a bad actor, and that's not normal industry practice.
Thank you very much. I have to be able to go back to Mr. Nesfer. So let me ask you a question. Has life expectancy grown in the United States or gone down in the last 50 years?
It would depend on the community.
No, it doesn't.
But on broadly,
Actually,
it has,
over the
it has
last
gone
50
up.
years, all of them have gone up. And would that be true about the Navajo Nation?
Among younger folks, yes.
No. The last 50 years, actually, it's gone up across the board. So let me ask you a question. With that being said, and you brought it up, which tribe is closest to and is more predicated on ANWR? Is it the Inupiats or the Gwich'in?
I believe you're over time.
What? No, I want an answer. It's Inupiat, and they're for ANWR. And there has been a lot of discussion in regards to Native peoples. One last question, when it's going to Navajo Nation actually has an energy company, does it not? NTEC?
It does, yes.
And it violates the rules
Which rules are you referring
that
to?
we're talking about?
I could not answer that, but it's a controversial company within the Navajo Nation based upon the research that I've done.
I would dispute that, so I yield back.
Thank you. And before we bring this hearing to a close, I'd like to ask each witness one last question, briefly, no more than 1 minute. What's the one question you were not asked today that you wish you were asked, and what would be your answer? Dr. Nessifer, is there one question you were not asked that we should have really brought up?
I think cultural significance of landscapes and how differently that varies between what we see with the Republicans and then the Native American communities.
Thank you. Ms. Sagama, is there any question we should have asked you, or you would have liked us to have asked you that you'd like to respond to that question?
Well, I think Mr. Gosar was getting at it there just before he left, which is that many communities across the West are very welcoming of oil and natural gas development, including tribal communities, the 3 affiliated tribes, the Navajo Nation, the Southern Utes, the Utes in Utah, because that oil and natural gas development brings prosperity, economic development, and job creation to their communities.
Mr. Basil?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish you had asked me if this bill would stop oil and gas production on federal lands, because I think it'll have very little impact on that.
It'll have very little impact?
Very little impact. It will just bring the practice up to what's happening on state and private land. In that sense, it's an equalizer, and it's equalizer towards the public.
So it will not have the dire warnings of doom and gloom that...
We will still produce plenty of energy in this country if this bill passes.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Kolbenschlag.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the subcommittee again for this opportunity. I wish I would be asked if master leasing plans and Nepa is onerous and duplicative. My answer would be no. As I mentioned, where I live, our underlying resource management plan is 30 years old. It never looked at oil and gas development in the area at all. And so it's simply not appropriate to be leasing under that document. A master leasing plan would help provide that extra layer to ensure that local governments and small rural communities like my own have an opportunity to weigh in. So thank you again for bringing this legislation.
Thank you for those responses. I thank all the witnesses for your valuable testimony, for coming to this hearing, and also for the members for their thoughtful questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit their witness questions within 3 business days following this hearing. We'll all have 3 business days following this hearing, and that the hearing record will be held open for an additional 10 business days for those responses. If there's no further business, without objection, this committee now stands adjourned. Let me just go and